Ladies and gentlemen, we might make a start in the interest of time. My name's Bruce Abernethy. I'm the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Health and Behavioural Sciences, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for this very exciting event. I should start, of course, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather and pay respects to elders past and present. One of the things I need to say on behalf of the Faculty of Health and Behavioural Sciences is we're always on the lookout for things that actually do something with health and behavioural sciences. And it's hard to think of a better example than the session we're about to have this evening, where there's a combination of an extremely influential theory grounded in the behavioural sciences that has impacts across a whole range of fields, not the least of which is health sciences. I think extraordinarily lucky to have this evening here as a presenter, Professor Richard Ryan. Richard, as the title slide will indicate, of course, is now a professor in the Institute of Positive Psychology and Education at the Australian Catholic University, and concurrently a research professor in psychology at the University of Rochester in New York. To many of you, perhaps all of you, Richard will be best known for his extraordinarily influential book co-authored with Edward Deci on self-determination theory. This introduced not only a new way of conceptualising personality development and motivation, but it had impacts and influence that put its fingers into a whole range of domains of human experience. And it's extraordinary actually looking at the cross-section of people who have replied to the invitation to attend tonight to see how diverse the interests are and how many sectors are represented. So not only the interest that one might expect in health sciences, but also in areas such as education, sport, learning theories, psychotherapy, video games and beyond. For the academics amongst you, a bit of target setting and aspirational goals to start off with as I describe something of Richard's academic record. Richard has published over 300 papers and books on human motivation, personality, psychological well-being. He's among the most cited of researchers in the field of psychology, with over 120,000 citations. Those of you who have cited him might want to remind him of that when we have some nibbles later on. He probably owes you something. He also has an extraordinary H-index of 126. Now, for many of you who are outside academia, you'll wonder what this means. So the H-index, a Hirsch index, is an increasingly common metric in academia to measure the impact and influence of someone's published work. So an H of 126 means there's been 126 different pieces of research, different published papers, that have been cited by at least 126 people. Now, what does that mean in context? So for the average academic, if there's such a thing, across a career you might expect an increment of about 1 in a Hirsch index with each additional year. So I conclude from this, either Richard is extraordinarily influential or he's a hell of a lot older than he appears. And so we'll give him an opportunity to see which of the two holds true in a moment. Richard's the recipient of many distinguished career awards, as you would expect, a Fellow of the American Psychological Association, a Fellow of the American Educational Research Association, and an honorary member of the German Psychological Society. I could go on explaining and detailing Richard's achievements, but that's not what you came to hear this evening. So the plan this evening is Richard will talk for roughly an hour and a quarter. The topic is well known to you and evident already. At the end of that time, we will throw the floor open for questions. We've allocated roughly 15 minutes for that. Please use that time. At the completion of the session, which will be roughly around 6:30, There will be drinks and nibbles outside and an opportunity to get that 1985 book copy signed and to remind Richard of how you've contributed to the 120,000 citations that, to which he's now accredited. Can I remind you, if you have a mobile phone, can you please make sure it's to the silent mode for the listening pleasure of others. So with those so few words, it's turned into more than I anticipated, I'd like to welcome Professor Richard Ryan to address you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Thanks very much. Thanks. Is my microphone on? Can you, I guess I'm trying to see if my microphone is on. Thank you very much for those kind words and introduction. I actually am 126 years old. So first I'd like to thank all of you for coming out on this beautiful evening. It's something for a person who's a motivational psychologist to wonder if anybody would come out on a nice evening to listen to a lecture at this point in time. So you might be motivated, or maybe it's supposed to rain and I didn't realize this. But before I begin my lecture tonight, I want to acknowledge that all the work that I do in the area of self-determination theory is deeply collaborative work. We have a wonderful community of researchers around the world, and I rarely work alone. I usually have wonderful team members. I have had awesome students over the years, and those are the people who really are responsible for much of what I'll talk about tonight. I'd also like to thank very much Jenny Ziavani tonight, who's brought and hosted me here, and Ann Polson, who's also hosting me here. And if I give a bad lecture tonight, the two of them are to blame for this. I'm going to talk about self-determination theory tonight. And self-determination theory is something that really we started in the late 1970s at DC and myself. And we really began with a very important topic to us, which was the idea of intrinsic motivation. I'll talk about intrinsic motivation tonight. It's the motivation, though, that where we do something just because it's inherently interesting to us. It's a pervasive motivation in human beings, something we don't capitalize on enough. And we were interested very early on in our careers about things that will facilitate or undermine intrinsic motivation. But from that work, we quickly saw and understood that that's not all of human motivation. Most of what we do, particularly as adults, is not intrinsically motivated. We're often goal-oriented, instrumentally motivated, needing to do things that aren't inherently interesting or challenging or fun. And this is the area of extrinsic motivation. And our wondering there was, how can we help people to become autonomous and volitional for these things that may not be inherently interesting? And I'll talk about that tonight in terms of the topic of internalization. And as we explored the conditions that led people to be both intrinsically motivated or more volitional in the things that they do that are extrinsically motivated, we also saw that those conditions were deeply related to the things that also make people well and promote their well-being and their health. And that led us to develop some theories of overall well-being in people. And those are the three main things I do want to talk about tonight. I'm hoping to touch on a couple other topics. We can't cover everything in this very short session tonight, but I hope to talk a little bit about our conscious and our unconscious motivations and their alignment at times when we are truly autonomous. I want to talk a little bit about close relationships, particularly parents and children, but also with people and their clinicians and practitioners, and what forms, and with teachers, and what makes for a good relationship in that sense. And I'm hoping to end the evening a bit by talking about life aspirations and the influence of the goals that we and our children have in life and how that has an impact on their overall well-being. And I apologize in one other sense as I talk about things tonight, which is that I'm new to Australia. I took my job here last March. I'm still learning Australian, so my accent is terribly Connecticut. And so you'll have to bear with that this evening. So you will suffer, I'm sure, greatly before this is over. SDT has been applied in a lot of different areas. And again, I'm not going to talk about all of these tonight. But one of the exciting things for me as a researcher and as a clinical psychologist, because that's my personal profession, is to see our research applied in so many fields, to be translated, to have our science translated into ways that are really helpful to people. And of course, for me, ultimately, that's the aim of all science, is to really bring it into practice and to better humankind. So I'm going to begin with a concept that I think is familiar to everybody in this room and is central to the work that we do in self-determination theory, and it appears here in big letters. It's the idea of motivation. Everybody here knows what motivation means. Motivation means to be moved into action. But even a little bit of reflection, we know that we can be moved into action by many different forces in the world. We can be moved into action because someone offers us a big reward. That did not happen to me for this lecture this evening, but someone offers us a reward that's very compelling, and that leads us to action. We sometimes can be driven to action because someone has a threat of punishment or a stick that they hold over us. This is a motivation for many, many activities in life. We can also be motivated into action by a value that we hold dear to our heart that compels us to act in a different way. And one of the keys to self-determination theory is that these different things that move us into action have a huge impact on the quality of the behaviors that follow from it. Now, when I grew up in psychology, there was a dominant theory of motivation, and it is symbolized here by what you see. This is a Skinner box, and operant psychology was the predominant theory of motivation at that time. And what I want to argue this evening is that there's nothing wrong with this theory of motivation. I think it's a very compelling and complete theory of motivation for the conditions that we see right here in this picture. If you have an organism and you have total control over its environment and you can shape the rewards and punishments that it will receive, you can pretty much get that organism to do anything you want. If I have a powerful enough reward, let's say for this young woman who's sitting here in the front, and I say, I have a powerful reward. I have $1 million, and if you jump up and down 3 times, I will give you the $1 million. Would you do that? Yes, she says yes. She knows I don't have it, so she's not that enthusiastic. Equally so, if we were in the United States, so I would say, I can't use this example here, and I had a gun. That's an example I can't use here, but in the United States I might have one and say, if you don't jump up and down 3 times, I will shoot you. She might jump up and down three times if she really believed I would do that. So rewards and punishments can control people's behavior, and I will never argue that they can't. We often have to find a powerful thing to do it. The problem with them is not that it's not a viable theory under certain conditions, but people won't stay in your cage if they don't like the contingencies of reinforcement they're under. If I have a workplace with certain rewards or punishments for action, and people don't like those contingencies of reinforcement, they leave my cage. They quit that job. Children don't show up for school when they start to dislike the rewards and punishments that they're under in that kind of setting. Our patients stop coming into treatment if they don't like the rewards and punishments and incentives that we're giving them in that environment. The trouble is, for that theory, is that people have choices. And they will leave the cage if they don't like the contingencies that beset them within it. And so there's been a real change in the whole field of motivation since I was a young man, and not just in self-determination theory, but really the entire field has changed. We call it a Copernican turn in motivation, in the same way that people no longer see the Earth as the center of the universe or the solar system, but rather the sun. Because of the work of Copernicus, we no longer focus so much in motivation on how we can control organisms from the outside. Instead, the central problem in motivation is how can we understand the choices that people make? What drives them to make those choices? And how can we sustain their volition and their energy and their vitality as they're engaged in the goals that they do choose to pursue? So this is the lifeblood of the current field of motivation, not so much how we can control people, even though sometimes we can. So in this field of motivation, we're really concerned with what we would call the idea of volition, people volitionally or voluntarily doing the things that they do. And I'm going to talk about 2 forms of volition tonight. One is the idea of intrinsic motivation, when we do something because we find it interesting or enjoyable or edifying in its own right. And the second is internalized motivation, when we find something to be of value, of importance to us, and those are things that would allow us to do something willingly. And there are multiple ways to support volition in multiple domains, and there are also lots of ways of undermining volition, of disturbing it, and I hope to talk about some of those dynamics. When we think about and I'm going to use very, very broad strokes here for this first part, to say the underlying theory of self-determination theory is that there are some basic psychological needs people have if they are going to be vital and energized and motivated to do something. And we say that these are basic needs. There's only 3 of them because they're so basic: the needs for autonomy, for competence, and relatedness. And I'm going to talk about those needs, but before I do so, I just want to say something about why we use the term need. Because need is a powerful term, at least as we use it in Connecticut. In Connecticut, when we use the term need, we mean something that's essential to an organism's well-being, to its thriving, and to its integrity. So if something gets its needs met, it will grow, it will show integrity, it will be well. If it doesn't get a need met, whether it values the need or doesn't value the need, it will show degradation and deprivation. Now, people use the term need in many different ways, of course, in the English language. Sometimes we use the term need to say, I need a 3rd vacation home, or I need a 2nd Mercedes, or I need 5 more fancy suits. But when we use the term in those ways, we know we don't really mean necessity, as I imply here. It means that I have a strong preference for something. Now, I'm not using the word in that way about preference because a need is something, as I said, essential, and it's an objective idea, not just a subjective idea. I may need vitamin C, but I may dislike eating fruits, vegetables, or taking supplements. But if I don't get any vitamin C, as Captain Cook's crew would have discovered, then you get scurvy or other kinds of diseases. And again, the conscious value for vitamin C is not really the issue. It's whether you get it or not. And as it turns out, we believe that there are certain psychological needs that if a child or an adult doesn't get them, whether or not they value those things, they will suffer if they don't get them. And that's why our list is so short. We think these are evolved needs, that there's a strong evolutionary psychology that supports the 3 needs that we identify. We think, therefore, they're natural rather than acquired. We don't learn to need relationships. We need them from birth. We don't learn to need autonomy. It's an essential requirement of an active organism. We don't learn to need efficacy. Efficacy is part of our built self. So again, it's not about whether we consciously value it, and we say that these needs are universal. They cross all cultural boundaries and all developmental boundaries, as I'll show some evidence for. So because of the strong definition of needs, we have only 3. We argue all the time of whether there's a 4th or a 5th. Right now there's a big debate in our circles about a 4th need. I'm not even going to talk about it because it'll just get me off into the debate. But these 3 have turned out to have a lot of empirical support. And the first one is the need for relatedness. For us, relatedness means to feel cared for, to feel like a significant person, that you matter in a particular environment. And the need for relatedness is met both by that sense of being cared for and also the opportunity to care for others. Both of those things really strengthen the sense of significance, of mattering, and of relatedness. The second need is one that's probably the least controversial in all of motivational psychology, because every motivation theory posits a need for competence, not always with the word need. Self-efficacy theory, achievement motivation theory, all of these would say competence is important, but it is important, the need to feel mastery and control over the things that are significant to you in life, to feel that sense of effectiveness in your living context. And the most controversial within our work, and the one I'll therefore focus on the most tonight, is the need for autonomy, and so I want to say a few things about it. Autonomy for us means that you behave in a way that feels willing, that there's a willingness, or as I've used the word before, volitional. To be autonomous means you endorse what you're doing. You don't feel it's imposed on you. You support its being done. You self-endorse the activity. And the opposite of autonomy is to feel heteronomy, that you feel controlled, that something is imposed or forced on you from the outside. When you're autonomous, your implicit and your explicit motives tend to concur, and you have a sense of agency and volition. So I want to say some things, too, because it's such an important concept for us about what it's not. It's not independence. You can be volitionally or autonomously dependent, or you can be volitionally or autonomously independent. When I'm ill and I go to my doctor and I'm sick, I say to her, would you please treat me? I need help. She has the competence. I don't. I'm being volitionally dependent. I'm autonomously turning myself over to her care. And when I get help from my wife, which I do all the time, she's here in the auditorium, so I definitely need to say this tonight, that I'm volitionally being dependent on her. When my kids were adolescents, they would come to both of us often and they say, Dad or Mom, I could use some help or some advice. This is a very healthy form of dependence, and they did it willingly. In fact, we show in much of our research that the healthiest adolescents are the ones that are volitionally dependent, not the ones who are independent of their parents, because independence at that age is typically unrealistic and comes about usually for the wrong reasons. You can also be volitionally independent when you say, this is something I'd like to do on my own. I don't want help with this, and that's a time when you are being volitionally independent or autonomously independent. So you can have all forms of dependence and independence crossing with autonomy and heteronomy, and there's no direct relationships between the two things. And again, in our healthcare professions, creating conditions under which people can be volitionally dependent on us when they want and seek our advice and want to depend on it, this is an important thing for us as motivationalists. Equally so, there's been a lot of controversy about individualism and collectivism, but in the same way, you can be autonomously collectivistic or autonomously individualistic. In fact, our research shows that it's much easier for most people to be autonomously collectivistic, for them to volitionally endorse the values of more collectivistic cultures than it is to actively endorse those of individualistic cultures, at least as it's sometimes portrayed. So this, too, I'll show tonight. This is one of the reasons why autonomy turns out to be a universal concept. This doesn't mean that all cultures equally value something like autonomy. For instance, we've been doing work recently in Israel with Bedouin women. Many Bedouin women don't have any autonomy in their lives. They don't have any choice. They don't have a lot of voice. And they will sometimes say to us, we don't need that. That's not important in our culture. And I believe that they are saying something that is normative. And nonetheless, we think we can detect negative health effects and negative well-being effects because of that lack of voice and choice in their life. So the issue of having no value, again, is not the same as the importance of a need. Similarly, as a clinical psychologist, I've had lots of patients who have come to me and said, I'm done with relationships. I don't need any more intimacy in my life. And usually when they say that, that means that they've been burned or hurt or injured in past relationships, and they'd rather avoid that risk again. But nonetheless, I know as a clinician, if they can't find a way to establish intimacy and connect with other people and feel that sense of belonging and importance again, that they will suffer over the next while. So I digress here, but the notion of individualism, collectivism, again, is orthogonal to the idea of being autonomous or not autonomous. You can even follow the command of someone else in an autonomous way. If we were driving here this evening and a police person were to step into the road and say, stop, there's an accident ahead, because I would believe in the value of traffic laws, I would autonomously stop for this law. And similarly, we study soldiers and various Israeli soldiers, and more recently I've seen studies on Portuguese soldiers and U.S. soldiers. And those who really believe in the legitimacy of command volitionally follow it, and they turn out to be more effective ongoing soldiers. So it's not that you have a command, it's that you endorse its meaning or its legitimacy, and therefore you can autonomously follow it. But sometimes we're told or commanded to do things that we can't endorse, that run against our values, and in that sense all we can experience is heteronomy. So, and finally I would just say it's not the same thing as freedom, and we don't use these terms equivalently. For us, the idea of freedom is that you remove constraints, but sometimes freedom, just removing constraints, can leave people feeling lost and without guidance and without scaffolding. Sometimes we would autonomously have those constraints lifted. Sometimes we want structure, and that is an expression of autonomy as well. So now let me get to some research. And I'm going to show a lot of research tonight, and I do know that there'll be a lot of numbers on the board. I think we'll be sharing with anyone who wants it the slide set that's here. So bear with some numbers. I'll explain what's going on in the slides anyway. But we started our own research with this idea of intrinsic motivation because it really interested us a lot, and there wasn't really much research on it at the time. It was a concept that came from primate research. Really, it's coined by Harry Harlow as he looked at the curious behaviors of his chimpanzees in laboratory settings, and he was actually the first person to show that when he started to reward chimpanzees for exploratory behavior, they stopped doing the exploratory behavior unless they were getting rewards. So he showed the first undermining effects of rewards on intrinsic motivation in primate colonies. We picked up the term, and my colleague Ed Deactivation was the first person to do a study with humans that we know of to look at this phenomenon. The concept of intrinsic motivation is when you do something because it's inherently enjoyable. And there's so much that we do that's of this type of motivation. This child who's up here on the right-hand side who's playing in the sandbox is intrinsically motivated. He's not getting rewards for playing in the sand. He doesn't need anybody to tell him it's a good thing. It turns out his brain is developing as he's doing so. He's learning things. He's learning about his physical environment. He's developing greater coordination. There are many benefits to being intrinsically motivated, neurological and physical, but he's not doing it for that reason. And if we went up to him and said, this is good for your brain, he would probably find it a lot less interesting to be playing in the sand than he does at the moment. He's doing it because it's inherently enjoyable, and he's finding satisfactions in the moment engaging in this activity. So children's play is a prototype of intrinsic motivation, and we know how important children's play is to their developmental health. But it's not just for children. Across the lifespan, one hopes we all keep some intrinsic motivation going, that we all have some areas of our life where we find interest and engage in activities just for their own sake. In fact, most of learning across the lifespan, even though we sometimes forget this in our school settings, is because of intrinsic motivation. We're always trying to learn about the environments around us, and children, again, exemplify this, but hopefully we do so as adults. We really, truly learn and assimilate things because we find them interesting. And, again, the exploration that a child will do in their physical environment when we allow them to do it, there's a lot of learning that goes on there. But even as we read the newspaper in the morning, I'm kind of a vociferous newspaper reader. I read a couple of newspapers every morning. I don't do it because it relates to my job particularly. I just am really interested in the human race and what's going on in it, and it happens that I learn while I'm doing that. So across the lifespan, intrinsic motivation powers a lot of learning, and it's a fuel for learning that we don't take enough advantage of in schools. Because, again, our cross-sectional studies, and not just ours, Susan Harder's, other people in the United States, and I haven't looked at the samples here, I suspect it's the same, which is if you look at intrinsic motivation for school learning, the slope looks something like this. Here you can see really exacting data that I put up here from Google Image. But this is actually, when you look at the slope of intrinsic motivation in public schools in the United States, you see that it has a slope that's like this. It begins very high when they come into kindergarten and first grade, and it goes down up through about 10th grade and then levels out with a couple of big dips in it. One is between 3rd and 4th grade for some developmental reasons that I could go into that are really about the understanding of ability and effort attributions at that point in time. Another time it dips again is whenever children enter junior high, whenever they start leaving home-based classrooms and go into the kind of, in our country, more police state kind of style of junior high schools where bells are ringing, detentions are happening, punishment is occurring, and they're learning right then that this is not an intrinsically motivating environment. And what's interesting about that particular dip is that it doesn't matter what age it is. It's not a developmental phenomenon. It's a social context phenomenon. This is really discovered by Jackie Eccles and others, that if you move the age up of junior high beginning, you avoid that dip in the loss of intrinsic motivation. So as we started to study it, our theory was pretty simple. We said that there were some basic needs that support intrinsic motivation. When kids could feel safe and secure and attached in their environment, that this would be a background factor important to being intrinsically motivated, so relatedness would be important. Secondly, they would need to stay intrinsically motivated for any activity. They need to feel mastery and effectiveness at doing it, so perceived competence would be really important. And then third, they would need to feel that the activity was something that was coming from themselves. They would have what we called an internal perceived locus of causality. And anything that would interfere with that sense of willingness or autonomy for doing the activity would undermine or take away intrinsic motivation. And so in the late 1970s for me and for Ed, DC, and then through the 80s, and really up to the current day, there's been a lot of experiments, laboratory experiments, looking at the dynamics of intrinsic motivation using this very simple theory. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how an experiment might be done. We might bring a child into the lab and give them an interesting puzzle-type activity that we've already pre-tested to be interesting to most kids. And then we might put them in a condition where we don't give them a particular pressure toward an outcome, but in a contrasting condition we might say, this is a task we want you to do, and we want you to attain a certain goal in this task. And we always make the goal something that they could easily attain, so it's not a competence issue, but the idea is we're telling them what the goal should be. And then we let them do the activity, and they finish the activity. They typically get positive feedback, and then we leave the room. We find a way to leave the room and let them stay alone, and they're told they can either continue with this activity or they can do other activities that are there in the room. And then we record the amount of time they spend on the target activity after we've put them through one or the other of these conditions. And we call this the free choice behavioral measure of intrinsic motivation. So the longer they persist at the target activity, when they're under no constraints and they believe no one is watching them, and they don't believe there's any rewards and punishments coming for it, this is a sign of their inherent interest in the activity. We usually supplement that afterwards by asking them about their interest and enjoyment of the activity, but the behavioral measure is the gold standard in this realm. And you can see various kinds of conditions that people have been put through before, both children and often college students. We do a lot of experiments with college students because they're a population of convenience and they're cheap. And so we might bring them in and we say, your goal is to do this, or we let them create their own goal, or we would tell them this is the strategy you must use, or we let people find their own strategy. Those would be conditions that would support autonomy or undermine autonomy, and we find reliably that these conditions on the left that support autonomy tend to enhance people's free choice behavior, whereas if you threaten them with punishments, or you impose goals, or you impose strategies, or you tell them it's an evaluative thing where you're going to evaluate their competence or their prowess or their intelligence at something, these things undermine their intrinsic motivation for the activity. When you give people choice over what they're doing, it tends to enhance that sense that this is coming from myself, and therefore enhances their motivation. Similarly, if you give people tasks that are optimally challenging, and for us, optimal challenging doesn't mean sit at the edge of your seat and have all of your skills put to the test. It means something that you feel readily mastering, that you have a great deal of success at. This is optimal challenge. It's not like Csikszentmihalyi's theory, because we actually find that if you put people in that thing in the flow diagram where they're right at this skill demand balance, that in fact people might like that moment, but then they are not so intrinsically motivated to continue the activity. We mostly in our lives want to feel a lot of mastery. If I'm skiing, I want most of my skiing down the slope to be pretty easily to master. Once in a while, I want that really difficult slope. And this is true for all learning, which is most of the time we want ready mastery. So positive feedback enhances motivation, whereas giving people things that are over their head or too difficult undermines their interest in the activity and undermines their free choice behavior. And similarly, if you have people in a laboratory setting and you treat them in a cold and distant manner, something turns them off to the whole motivational environment, and they tend to be less intrinsically motivated, where if you treat them with respect or with empathy as experimental subjects, this enhances their motivation. Just a couple recent examples applying this theory. This is a study that was done by Domingues and colleagues in Portugal, and it was done on children's choices over foods. And so they were interested in what would get kids to be interested in eating their vegetables. And so they measured kids ahead of time in terms of their preferred vegetables, so they already knew what vegetables the kids like. And in one condition, They give them a choice of you can have that preferred vegetable or you could have the second preferred vegetable that you have. That was a choice condition for them, and children chose that, and they looked at how much of that vegetable they ate. In another condition, they just put out their two preferred vegetables and said you can eat as much of these two things as you want. So it was another kind of choice condition. In a third condition, they chose the child's own preferred vegetable, and they said this is the vegetable you'll be eating today. So a no-choice condition. And then they looked at how much the children ate. And here you can see their diagram here, which is the total vegetable intake was the lowest in the no-choice condition. Again, this was their preferred vegetable, but the fact of being put in a situation where you don't feel choice undermines something about your willingness to engage in an activity here, eating. Now, the most controversial thing in our early work, it's not so controversial anymore, was what we called the undermining effect of rewards on intrinsic motivation. And this is where if you give somebody a reward for doing something that's intrinsically motivating, it does something to their motivation, which then later has them less interested or intrinsically motivated for the activity. So if I have a child who's doing a task just on their own, and I come in and say, I really like that you're doing that, I'm going to give you $5. All right, now $10. Every time you do that activity, the child will like getting the rewards. Oh, great, I'll get the $5 or $10. And then what happens is that during a free choice period, after having been paid for doing the activity, now they're no longer interested in the activity. So something has shifted in their psychology, their internal attributional psychology, where before they were doing it out of interest and enjoyment, but now they're doing it because Rich is paying them to do the activity, which they liked being paid for the activity, but now when I'm no longer paying them and the free choice is like, well, now he's not paying me, so I have no reason to do the activity. There was a shift from the internal causality that was there before to now I'm the cause of their behavior. And if I'm not around to be paying them some more, there's no cause for their behavior, and their motivation's undermined. Now, the theory is controversial because we've never said that all rewards undermine intrinsic motivation. Some rewards are not controlling. It's when I use a reward to control someone else's behavior, this is when it's undermining of motivation. So this is a meta-analysis that you'll see here that came out in 1999. It's still pretty much the definitive meta-analysis in the area, although there's been many more studies done since this time. You see at the top, it says all rewards. So all rewards have a very weak negative effect on intrinsic motivation. There's a D there, minus 24, I think it is. Very weak effect. That's because rewards are of different types. If you go down one level, it's divided into verbal rewards, which we would actually, in our theory, call praise or competence feedback. And you see that verbal rewards tend to enhance intrinsic motivation because they enhance people's feeling of competence. I say you're doing really well at this activity. That doesn't undermine a sense of causality. It increases a sense of competence, so it tends to increase people's intrinsic motivation. Whereas if you give people tangible rewards, on the other side you see a D of minus 34, a little bit stronger here now, almost moderate size. That's undermining of intrinsic motivation. If you look, though, under praise, it's a heterogeneous effect. You see college students, when you praise college students, it has a very positive effect on their motivation. The studies that have been done at that time with children, when you praise children, it had no positive effect on their motivation. And why is that? Because the way we praise children is often very controlling. Oh, Bruce, I like the way you're sitting up straight and paying attention now. That's the way we use praise. Children know right away that use of praise is an attempt to control their behavior. And it can actually undermine rather than enhance. And we'll talk a little later about the kinds of praise that actually enhance. But one of the things, we also find that in studies, even of college students, sometimes there are gender effects. Men are almost always enhanced by praise because when you praise them, they actually believe it's about their competence. Whereas when you praise women in the lab, they're wondering, like, what are you up to? So sometimes they're more likely to be undermined than men. And so we say this is because all of these effects are about the psychological meaning of the events as they impact the person's perceived locus of causality. And we could go down further. Unexpected rewards, you see, don't undermine, because if you do an activity and at the end of the, like you have a classroom and everybody's been working hard today and say, you know, we've all been working so hard, I'm going to get pizzas for the whole group of us. This doesn't undermine motivation because they were not being controlled. But if I ahead of time say, if you work hard today, I will give you pizzas at the end of the day, Now the behavior is being controlled through my pizza giving, and this will undermine. So the same reward will have different effects depending on how it's given. So we could go down on this list further, but the more you use a reward in a controlling manner, the more it's likely to have this negative effect on intrinsic motivation. There's lots of ways of showing this. I'm just going to show a kind of more recent way this can be demonstrated. This was a study that was led by Cole Murayama, who's somebody I've been working with on a few different studies recently. He's just a brilliant young researcher at University of Reading. And he wanted to show the undermining effect in fMRI. How many people in this room have been in an fMRI? So a few of you have been in. So those of you who have been in know it's probably pretty hard to find an intrinsically motivating activity you can do inside of a magnet. It's not a great environment to be in. But he found an activity that was a little stopwatch activity, reaction time activity, that you could do inside of a magnet, and people found it fun. And then for half of the subjects in his study, he gave them rewards when they had good trials in this task. He told them this ahead of time: I'll give you rewards when you have an accurate performance on this task. And for the other half, there was never any rewards introduced. They were just playing the game inside of the magnet. And there's a couple slices I'm going to show you here, but this fMRI slice here is the bilateral striatum, and this is an area of our brain where we would typically be sensitive to reward effects in our environment. And what you can see here is that in session 1, when people are getting rewards for performance, financial rewards for getting performance, there's a lot of activation going on in the bilateral striatum. But I want you to note as well, there's also significant activation going on in the bilateral striatum when there's no rewards being given, because people are finding the task inherently rewarding. They're finding it fun and interesting, which is a kind of reward for our human brains. Now, what's interesting is that in session 2, people come back, they're engaged in the same activity, but there's no rewards being offered to anybody in this activity. And if this were just an extinction paradigm in the classic behavioral sense, what you should see is that the red bar would drop to where the blue bar is, because now rewards would be no longer there. But what you actually see is people who were formerly rewarded are showing almost no activation in this reward area of the brain. They're not finding the activity interesting anymore. And this is the classic undermining effect. And you see the same pattern in the lateral prefrontal cortical areas. There's an area of the brain where we'd typically be looking for cognitive engagement. And people here are cognitively engaged in both conditions, in the reward condition and in the no reward condition in session 1. But in session 2, those who had previously gotten rewards are now disengaged, actively disengaged from this task. This is another way of showing the undermining effect. And there's lots of studies. This is a really cool study that was done at Max Planck Institute by Warneken and Tomasello. They've argued I think very compellingly that children are intrinsically motivated to help other people, that it's part of our nature to do good in the world and to help other people. And they show that children will spontaneously help a stranger or an experimenter with any kind of task, like if they drop the clothespins in their laboratory or they can't get into a cupboard, children will spontaneously come over and help. And they show that they'll do this whether they get rewards for it or not in the initial sessions. But what they also show is that children who are rewarded for their helping behavior, and here they give them this kind of cube-type reward that makes a little special effect in a machine, and that children will understand at 20 months old is a reward. They'll say, I'm giving you this because you did this. Then subsequently, these children are less likely to help strangers than if they had never been rewarded at all. So being praised here, being said, that was really nice that you helped, that doesn't undermine motivation. Saying nothing and giving no reward, that doesn't undermine motivation. Still, children want to be helpful. Giving them rewards for being helpful undermines their inherent altruistic propensities. So these things have a lot of practical, I know, isn't it really sad? Hopefully they did something to make up for that. There's a lot of applications to this in the real world, and I'm just going to begin with one early study that Ed and I did in Rochester with our colleague Louise Scheinman and Alan Schwartz. We were in a school system, and in the summertime, before teachers saw any of the children in their classroom, so before they were exposed to their classroom, we gave them a survey about how they dealt with motivational problems in their classroom. We called it the Problem in School survey. And it might be that Jill is in your class, and Jill's been listless and uninvolved, and she hasn't been doing her homework lately. What would you do with Jill? And some teachers said, well, I would make sure Jill knew the consequences for not doing her homework. She would stay in from recess, or she would get some consequence for not doing it. And when she did it, we would give her gold stars, maybe put them on the board, or some other kind of reward. So we called those teachers controlling teachers because they're using external controls to motivate children. Other teachers said, well, if Jill's been uninvolved or listless in my class, something must be going on with Jill, and I need to empathize with Jill, find out what's going on. I need to get inside her frame of reference to see what the problem is, because otherwise she'd be motivated. Maybe that means talking to the parents, see if something's going on at home, see if there's some block or barrier inside Jill. So they start by empathy and perspective taking in solving a motivational problem. And we call these teachers autonomy supportive. And then we followed the children in their classrooms in a longitudinal study over the school year. I'm just showing you the correlations here from 5 weeks into the school year. So 5 weeks after children have been exposed to teachers with these different motivational philosophies, there's big differences in the classroom. Children who are coming from classrooms where teachers tend to use rewards and punishments to motivate are less interested, less curious about their schoolwork, so they've lost intrinsic motivation. They're less independent. They're less likely to actively engage in activities until they're told to engage in activities. And they want easier rather than harder problems to do in school. The opposite is true for those who are in autonomy supportive classrooms. But as a clinical psychologist, especially at that time as a young clinical psychologist who was doing treatment with children, these next findings really struck me. 5 weeks into the school year, if you were in a classroom with a controlling teacher, you were feeling worse self-esteem in general and worse about your cognitive capacities. But if you were in a classroom with an autonomy supportive teacher, those were being raised. In fact, the following year, we did a longitudinal study where we picked teachers who were particularly autonomy supportive and those who were particularly controlling, and we showed the spreading effect in opposite directions within those first 5 weeks of the school year of kids who were exposed to these different regimens. Now, it happened at this time we were also working, Ed and I were working with a Fortune 500 company. We gave the same problem in schools questionnaire to managers in the Fortune 500 company across the country. They were working with people who were called customer service representatives, people who fixed business machines. We found that those who worked for a manager who was more controlling in his or her motivational style were less satisfied with their jobs, they were less satisfied with their pay and benefits, and they were less satisfied and trusting in the corporation as a whole. And the opposite was true if they worked for autonomy supportive managers. So this isn't a kid thing, this is a human thing. Any of us, if we work in a controlling environment, after 5 weeks of being in that environment, will start to change not only our opinions about our motivation, but also about ourselves. And that's what we see in these studies with kids. And this is true across the world. There's been lots of studies. I'm going to move along a little bit here. This was just a recent study Young-Shim Yang led in South Korean high schoolers, where you see that their perceptions of the teaching environment has an impact on an array of variables through its impact on their basic psychological needs satisfactions in classrooms. And of interest to us is just the variation in interest day to day in classrooms. And with Ulrich Trottwein, who at that time was at Max Planck Institute, and his team that's now at Tübingen University, we designed a study where we looked at day-to-day variations in teachers' controllingness or autonomy support, away from the teacher's own mean. And so this is called a multi-level modeling study. In the bottom part of this study here, where it says between student level, the average teacher autonomy support or controllingness has an impact on the student's interest in their mathematics or their mother tongue here, German, or their typically English or Russian in this particular case, second language learning. But in this multi-level model, we also look at the students' fluctuation day to day in their interest in what's going on in class, and it fluctuates with the teacher's day-to-day fluctuation in her or his controllingness or autonomy support. So on a day, as a supervisor or a clinician, when I come in and for whatever bug is going on for me, I'm a more controlling supervisor or teacher. On those days, I can be sure that my patients or my students will be less engaged than they are typically. Just to take this to another domain, recently Kimberly Bartholomew led a study that she was nice to let me on of athletes across England looking at controlling and autonomy supportive coaches. And these were all the way from youth level clubs all the way up to relatively elite young athletes. If you had a controlling coach, That tended to thwart your basic psychological needs. You felt less relatedness, less competence, less autonomy, and this had an impact on greater feelings of burnout and negative affect. And the opposite was true if you had a more autonomy supportive coach for these various sports. For a subset of these athletes, we were able to intervene a little more, and we were able to take an assay from the inside of their mouth. We took a mouth swab from the mucosa so that we could assess SIGA, secretory immunoglobulin A. Now, the reason we were interested in this is a mobilization your body has when it's under stress, and it's often a way of getting at acute stress. And what we found is if you have a controlling coach for your sport, even though we would hope sports would be fun and intrinsically motivating, then you experience more need thwarting, and then on the way into practice, you were secreting more of this SIGA, showing that there's more acute stress going on in these athletes. Now, I don't want to end my part on intrinsic motivation with such a downer, so I thought I would go to some place where we see intrinsic motivation really active in young people, for better or for worse, which is in video games. And I've been interested in video games for a while, partly because I'd never really played video games much, but people came to me and said, look, kids all around the world, not just kids, adults all around the world are playing video games. There must be something really intrinsically motivating about that, and we should understand that. And so, not being a video game player, I said, well, I should play a game to get a sense of this, so I picked this game here. It's called World of Warcraft. Anybody ever play that game? Well, a few of you have. A few of you won't admit it. So I started to play this game thinking, oh, I'm going to really hate this game, and I started to play it, and about 2 years later, I came out of my attic. I was totally addicted to this game. My wife, who's here in the room, knows that many times she would come up at 2 in the morning and say, it's really late. What's up? And I would say, I'm doing research, dear. I loved this game. I had to quit it because of my addictive nature. But why was this game so compelling? Well, one of the things that the designers have done in this game is they've made it a totally open world game. There's lots of choices, lots of places you can investigate, lots of opportunities for discovery. There's a myriad things that you can explore. So a lot of autonomy, a lot of choice they give you choice over the goals and the tasks that you take on. You're always getting positive competence feedback in this game. You're always leveling up. It's very hard. You don't level down ever in this game. You just always get more and more positive feedback. So there's this great feeling of growth and competence in the game. And finally, you get to group with other people. I had many friends in this game who became, I don't even know what they look like or who they are, but they were great friends in this game. I know them by their only game names and appearances. But really close because we cooperated, helped each other. Really a lot of relatedness in this game. Video game designers had figured out that there were some basic needs, that if you meet these needs, this will lead people to really want to be engaged in this activity. And of course, one of the reasons I'm interested in video games is because we should be harnessing some of these same principles in our designs of education or our designs of health training, our designs even of the health risk surveys that we have people doing. We can make them into more game-like atmospheres so people really engage them. We actually, in one of our longitudinal studies, we wrote a little book called Glued to Games, which is about the psychology of games with my colleague Scott Rigby. But we had people who were playing World of Warcraft, and we asked them about their psychological need satisfactions in their early gameplay. We also asked them how much fun it is, and then we followed them for the next 8 months to see who continued to play over time. And what you can see by the data here is that even though fun was mildly predictive of whether you kept playing, if you had fun in the initial session, it was really whether you were getting autonomy, competence, and relatedness needs satisfied. If you were getting those satisfied in the game, then you were likely to sustain engagement in this game over an 8-month period. So there's a reason kids are playing games and they're not doing homework. And it's about need satisfaction and feelings of competence. We're having so many kids that we're giving them messages that you're not competent at what you're doing at school. And it should be no surprise to us that at nighttime they would rather turn to an activity where they can feel a lot of competence. We're doing a lot of controlling them in their school environments, and it's no surprise to us that they should then want to turn to an environment where they can feel a lot of agency and a lot of autonomy in what they're doing. And we think of this as kind of an evil thing in the world, but it's also partly an evil that we have created a great gravitational pull around by the alternatives that we've set up. I always talk too long. I want to talk a little bit about extrinsic motivation here. And so as I move to this, I want to say our view of extrinsic motivation, it's everything that's not intrinsic motivation. When you're extrinsically motivated, you're doing something not because it's interesting, but because there's some goal that you have in mind. All instrumental motivation is extrinsic motivation. But again, there's many reasons why we do instrumental activities, and some of them I've already talked about here. One is because people are holding out rewards and punishments and getting us to do them through those means, and we call that external regulation. I've already said it's a very powerful form of motivation. It was well studied within operant psychology for over 6 decades. The problem is not its power, if you have the right rewards and punishments. It's that it doesn't last beyond the rewards and punishments. It's the maintenance and transfer problem. So as a clinician, if I'm controlling my patients using rewards, even my approval, the trouble is that their behavior doesn't last after treatment because they're no longer getting the approval or they're no longer getting the rewards. Maintenance and transfer is the biggest issue with external regulation. Another kind of instrumental motivation is introjection. And many of us as parents set up introjected motivation in our children when we give them extra love for doing the things that we want them to do, or we withdraw love when they don't do what we want, so that they get to feel only esteem for themselves when they're doing what we want. We call this conditional regard. And they feel bad about themselves when they're not doing what we want or what they've internalized as the thing they should want. Introjection is a very powerful motivation. Everybody who's been a university student in this room knows that you're probably driven quite a bit by introjection during a lot of your learning experiences. All of us have a lot of this going on in our lives. It's a very powerful motivation too, but it's very fragile, and it has a lot of internal costs for people. They suffer a lot under introjection as a style of motivation. The daughters and sons of tiger moms, as we'll show, have a lot of pain and aggravation, and many of them, of course, can't succeed despite the demands of everyone around them, and so they end up withdrawing, and it's a very fragile and difficult form of motivation. Still more autonomous as a form of motivation that's extrinsic is what we call identification, and now it's when I'm doing something instrumental, but it's because I actually have come to see the value or importance of it. So it may not be fun, but somehow somebody has transmitted to me through the reasons or through communicating to me why this is useful, or I've been able to see why it's useful, so I can do it volitionally. And then the ultimate autonomous form of extrinsic motivation is what we call integration, and this is when I now wholeheartedly am behind doing something because I not only consciously value it, but it fits with my other values as well, so I don't have to be in conflict with myself. So we say this is a continuum of autonomy. The more you move from external regulation up through introjection, the more autonomous you are for your extrinsically motivated activities. And typically for most of us, we have some combination of these things running in any given behavior. So, my work life is filled with a bit of introjection, a bit of identification, a bit of external regulation, I admit it. So it's got a little bit of combination, and we measure all of these things, and then we look at the overall relative autonomy people have. So this is an example from Japanese school children. If you ask Japanese school children, why do you do your homework? This was a study done by Yamauchi and Tanaka. They developed their own questionnaires based on self-determination theory about this. And you can see here that those who are doing it for external reasons have a very weak relationship with a learning orientation. They tend to superficially process the material around them. They're not deep learners. They're going through the motions here. Those who are introjected, and typically here it would be a Japanese child whose parent is contingently regarding their schoolwork, they're a bit more motivated, have a little more of a learning orientation. They have a particular performance orientation. They need to outcompete the others in class. This is their strong motivation. But you see again here, it's just mildly related to deep processing material, and it's strongly related to superficially processing. They're trying to reach the goal, not so much really learn. Whereas identified motivation, really understanding the value of schoolwork, you see much more learning orientation. There's a negative correlation with work avoidance. They want to be doing work, and they're much more deeply processing the material around them, and so it's true with intrinsic motivation. This is a pattern we see around the world. Now, here's a U.S. study that was led by Marianne Misrandino. It's a beautiful study. She's looking at 6th grade students, and she looks at their relative autonomy along this continuum of their motivation, and then looks at the experiences they're having in classrooms. And then she controls for their achievement abilities using the Stanford Achievement Test. And you can see here that although kids who are more able tend to have more positive experiences in classrooms, autonomy is having an independent effect above and beyond that. Kids who are more autonomous are more persistent, more curious, they participate more, they're less anxious, they're less bored, and they're less angry in class. And they also get better grades. Again, controlling for this because they're more willingly engaged in their classroom material. In exercise domains, we look at the same kind of thing. This was a study led by Martin Standage. I was at the University of Bath and had the privilege of working with him there. He asked people, why do you engage in exercise activity? And we know for a lot of us, it's not an intrinsically motivated activity. Sometimes we're doing it because our doctors told us that we should, or we're doing it because our wives tell us that we should. Not my wife, but somebody's wife might tell them that they should. Or because you'll feel better about yourself, or you feel guilt or shame when you don't, which would be closer to the introjection idea. Or you've come to really see the health value of it, which is the identified motivation, or you've actually found an exercise that's fun. Then he had people, after asking them why they exercise, he had them wear an Act-A-Heart device for about a week's period of time to see whether they actually engaged in the kind of moderate to vigorous activity that would really have a health impact, according to the American College of Sport Medicine. And you see here that it's only the autonomous forms of motivation that are actually predicting whether people actually exercise. Even when you're strongly motivated externally, it doesn't really pay off in terms of actually doing the activity. Even our unconscious motivation is affected by our relative autonomy. And this is a study that was led by Lisa Legault from Canada. And in this study, what she did, she asked people, why would you inhibit expressions of prejudice in a public arena? And some people said, well, I wouldn't. They were amotivated. They would be prejudiced anyway. Some people said, well, I wouldn't do it because you get in trouble if you express prejudice, and you're certainly going to get more rewards in your organizations if you don't show prejudice, so they were externally regulated. Some people said, well, I wouldn't be prejudiced because I wouldn't express prejudice because I'd feel bad about myself or guilty if I did it, and I feel better about myself when I don't look prejudiced to others. Some said, I don't value prejudice. I think it'd be a better world if we weren't prejudiced, and some people had really integrated that value. So you see a relative autonomy. Some people even said, I like a world where people aren't prejudiced against each other. It's a more fun and enjoyable world to be in. So even intrinsic motivation for this. So she looked at this continuum, and then she measured people's prejudice in two ways. One, explicitly, she just gave them a test of prejudice called the affective scale of prejudice. And you can see here that people who were more autonomously motivated to not express prejudice were indeed less prejudiced. But she also did a non-conscious method we call the implicit association test, where you use a kind of reaction time measure matching good and bad adjectives with minority or non-minority people. So you don't really know what your test results are around this. And that non-conscious assessment of racism was also related to how self-determined they were for not doing this. So we got to wonder, how is it that people get these splits between their conscious and their non-conscious motivations for things? And one of our reasonings was a little bit following Sigmund Freud, that when you're in really controlling environments, you tend to suppress certain aspects of yourself, and that leads to internal discrepancies in your motivation. So one place we thought we could test this was in the example of sexual orientations, because this is an area where there's a lot of social control, and a lot of times parents are trying to suppress any expression of counter-normative sexual orientations in their children. So we did a study. This is led by Netta Weinstein. There were actually 6 studies in this series. And in one of these studies here, we see that we measured maternal and paternal autonomy support versus control. And then we measured explicit sexual orientation. People came into our lab and we said, are you gay or are you straight? Here's a 10-point scale. And they put down where they were on the scale. And then we did an IAT assessment in some of our experiments, and in other ones we used other non-conscious methods, like we would eye track what kind of people that they looked at in magazines and things like that to look at their sexual orientation. So we'd use these things to get at the discrepancy between their explicit sexual orientation and their implicit sexual preferences, who they were really attracted to. And you see that there's greater discrepancies in people who come from more controlling families. So they're suppressing a part of themselves. And if there's a discrepancy, those people reported themselves more homophobia, more prejudice against gay and lesbian people. And you can see here that that interaction is entirely carried by one group here. It's the people who are explicitly straight but implicitly gay, or implicitly attracted to same-sex people. So if you're suppressing that piece of yourself because you're in a controlling environment, then you're more likely to be homophobic and prejudiced against other people. And Freud would have called this reaction formation. And this reaction formation is aggravated. It's made even stronger if your parents themselves are explicitly homophobic, if they express negative attitudes toward people who are gay or lesbian. So if Sigmund Freud was right about this thing, a lot of people in science don't like to ever say Freud was right about much, but certainly right about this. And here we're just seeing that it's a result of the lack of autonomy support in families. And you can imagine the suffering that goes on for people who have an implicit orientation or same-sex attractiveness and what's going on for them in their lives. And we've looked a lot at the pain of this over time, particularly with studies led by Nikki Legate. So there's a lot of importance to autonomous motivation. When you're more autonomously motivated, you have more engagement, deeper learning, more vitality, you're more congruent on the inside, and you have greater well-being. And so we're interested a lot in how we can get people moved up in this end of the continuum. And I want to say a few things about how we support those things. So being autonomy supportive with people, how do we be autonomy supportive? Well, first, we always start with the other person's perspective. If I want somebody to be motivated, I need to understand what do they see the barriers as being? What do they see the strengths of being? We do smoking cessation interventions. I never start with, you shouldn't be smoking. Or I start with, you're a smoker, you must really enjoy smoking. What's so great about it? What do you really like about this? And people have, I almost have become a smoker from interviewing smokers, because there's so many good things about smoking. Encouraging self-reflection. We want them to be reflective about it. We don't want to push our own attitudes on people. We want them to be able to reflect on their attitudes and to take interest in what's going on inside of them. When we have choices, we try and offer meaningful choices. Choice doesn't mean options. It means real choices that give you some pathway or some solution that you would endorse. When you want somebody to do something that might not be what they want to do, you have to give them a good rationale. It's impossible to be autonomously motivated for something unless you have a good reason for doing it. So if my boss at work wants me to do some onerous task, it helps when she tells me why, because then I can get on board with it. But if she just says, just do it, all I can do is feel controlled. Now, she wouldn't do that, but, well, sometimes she does. Anyway, so minimizing controlling language and rewards is fine. Don't use language that says this is what you should do, this is what you must do, this is what you have to do, but instead a language of choice, and not using rewards in controlling matters, but rather using rewards to acknowledge jobs well done. Competence supportive environments are those that are designed, as I said before, for mastery. So you can feel almost always that you're succeeding at something. So not giving people tasks they can't do, but tasks that you can readily feel mastery of. And then if there's difficulties in mastering tasks, to give them the scaffolding, the training, the skill development that allows them to feel that mastery. And we forget this so much in childhood because we have these benchmarks we think every child should be at. And the result of that is most of our children are not at those benchmarks. And that means that they don't have the right scaffolding at that moment in time to feel the mastery they would need to be volitionally motivated. And so feedback would be more about information. How can you succeed in activity rather than what you should be doing? And good feedback is never comparative. It's not, oh, you're doing better than the others here, but it's rather, you did this really well. It's praise for an accomplishment, praise for effort, praise for something you did. And finally, relatedness supportive environments are the environments where we really connect with the people who we're trying to motivate. So you're conveying respect for the people who you're trying to motivate. The person can feel, therefore, significant as an individual within that environment. When they have difficulties, when they're not doing what they're supposed to do, you come to them with a concern and a care about that rather than a criticism and an evaluation. And we say, that it's the cheapest form of motivation around. To this last piece of it here, which is we measure a lot people's motivation in workplaces and in classrooms, and one of the most predictive items of motivation is not, I like my teacher, or I like the classwork. It's my teacher likes me. My boss likes me. My coach likes me. This is a very powerful motivational item, and this is why I say it's really cheap. It doesn't take that much. A smile when the kid comes in the door. An appreciation for the efforts that they put in. These things don't cost us a lot, but they mean a lot motivationally. This is what lets people feel belonging and connection with the domain of activity. I'm running a little bit out of time, so I was going to show you some studies of parents and children that verify that autonomy-supportive teachers and parents do indeed produce better motivation. I'm just going to tell you a couple quick studies on this. We just finished a 23-country study. Chris Nemec led the study, but there are like 30 investigators on the study because each thing was done in its own native language. And we asked children across these countries, write us a small essay about the most motivating teacher you've ever had. They also write an essay about the most demotivating teacher they've ever had. And they write a small essay about the current teacher that they have. And these are counterbalanced for experimental design. And there's remarkable uniformity across the world. In every nation, the most important characteristics that came out from the coding of their essays was that there was teachers who were more relatedness-oriented and who were more autonomy-supportive. And I think it's remarkable that in no sample did the use of rewards or a grade focus or the common discussions we're having all about rigor and control and high standards and all these don't come out in children's minds in any way as a part of a motivating environment. What comes out for them is support for autonomy, relatedness, and competence. It's even true in our healthcare industry, and I'm just going to show a simple study here about adherence to medication taking. I'm sure it's true here in Australia. It's certainly true in the US that most of our patients don't take our medications as prescribed. So if we give medications out, even simple medications in the US, I think the statistics are about 40% of the time they're actually taken accurately. People don't take them long enough. They don't finish the regimen. They take too much or too little. They don't feel good right away, so they think this is useless. All kinds of reasons why they don't take medications. So we had a sample here. This was led by Gail Roden and Jeff Williams. It was a sample of about 100 people who were given prescribed an oral medication for a chronic disease. And we asked them about the interview with the physician who prescribed the medication, whether they were autonomy, supportive, or controlling. And then we asked them, why are you taking the medication using our measures of autonomy? And you can see here, and then we called the patients 2 days into the prescription. We said, we just wanted to check on something. We don't know how many pills you got. Could you bring the pills to the phone, dump them out, count them? We call this the 2-day pill count. It was unexpected for them. We did it again 2 weeks into the study. It works much better than those electronic pill caps, which have so many problems I can't even get into in studies. But these were some behavioral measures. We also asked them whether they were adhering to medication. And you can see here that autonomy support from the prescribing physician had a predictive value, a mild predictive value in terms of whether they were actually adherent. And their reasons for taking the medication, whether they truly understood the importance of it or they were just doing it because their doctor told them, was also strongly predictive of this. In fact, this accounted for more than 50% of the variance in their adherence to this very simple prescription of medicine. Now, there's been lots of studies in SDT looking at much more difficult regimens, diabetes regulation, HIV, prescription adherence, many more difficult problems than this. If it's this important on this very simple prescription issue, you can imagine how important it is on the more difficult ones. There's been meta-analyses on this, which is when healthcare practitioners use more autonomy-supportive techniques, their people tend to be more autonomously motivated to do what they're supposed to do in the studies. And when they use more controlling attitudes, language, and techniques, people are more controlled in their motivation, which means that they're going to be less adherent over time. And so our general model in self-determination theory has been something like this, which is using autonomy-supportive versus controlling interpersonal methods when you're trying to motivate people to do something, and the result of that is that they feel more need satisfaction in the context of their interactions with the prescribing person or with the practitioner. And these things on the right here, actually I'm going to put them up here, there's been successful randomized clinical trials in all of these domains showing the value of these techniques, from not smoking, physical activity, weight loss, diabetes management, adherence, healthy diet, even dental hygiene. If the dental hygienist uses more autonomy-supportive communications to tell you about flossing and the importance of flossing, people are more likely to floss and they show less gingivitis on follow-up. So these randomized controlled trials, I don't even have all of them up now, are just spreading across because of how important it is the way in which we motivate patients to change. And it's also true in psychotherapy. In psychotherapy, across modalities, the more autonomy supportive your psychotherapist is, the more effective treatment is going to be. This is just one study from David Zuroff's group in Montreal. They show that the odds ratio of having a more autonomy supportive therapist is about 2, meaning you're getting twice the effectiveness as the average, 4 times the effectiveness of a controlling person, whether you're doing cognitive behavioral therapy, interpersonal therapy, or just doing clinical pharmacological management for depression. In all of these realms, being more autonomy supportive has more positive impact on both patient autonomy and on depressive symptomatology. I was going to talk about relationships, and I think I'll just say a few things about it. We think autonomy is a really important ingredient in every quality relationship, and particularly our basic human attachments, our parental attachments. When we're more autonomy supportive with our children, they become more securely attached to us, but it's not just a parent-child thing either. This is just a recent study that was done from a Canadian group that was published in Child Development. They're looking at the Mary Main classic attachment interview with the mothers to look at how coherent the mother's attachment style has been. They're separately measuring maternal sensitivity as it's classically measured within the strange situation of Mary Ainsworth, and then they're measuring autonomy support in the way that we would conceptualize autonomy support and looking at the security of attachment of the child. And you can see that both sensitivity and maternal autonomy support predict the child's actual attachment. Now, we all have attachment issues in our life, and that's the model from that study. In our lives, in our daily lives, we're really securely attached to some people, and we're insecurely attached to others. So we have some people that we feel quite well around, and others where we feel self-conscious or nervous or other negative attachment symptoms. So this is college students at the University of Rochester, a study led by Jennifer LaGuardia. She's looking at the average security of attachment toward different figures in college students' lives. And you can see they're pretty securely attached to their mothers. They're really securely attached to their best friend. And sadly, they're about as securely attached to their fathers as they are to the arbitrarily assigned freshman roommate that they have. So this is a sad statement about we fathers in the world. I say this with all humility about fathers, but the reason for that is many fathers are not that responsive, sensitive, or autonomy supportive of their children, and this has to do with why they don't have secure attachments with them. But when we look at security of attachment, if you happen to be a father who's autonomy supportive, if you happen to be a father who supports the competence of your children, then you do have a secure attachment with them. Across all relationships, autonomy support predicts more secure attachments. And in fact, when we emotionally rely on other people, we tend to emotionally rely on those people who support our autonomy, and we don't go to people when we're in emotional troubles or have difficulties who are going to tell us what to do, who are going to give us advice, who are right away, who are going to in some way be controlling toward us. Those aren't the people we go to or emotionally express things to, particularly negative emotions. We tend to express those to the people who will take our frame of reference, who will give us, if anything, encouragement to make choices of our own, who will not be controlling towards us. Even our basic personality traits, when you're around people, and this is a cross-cultural phenomena, who are more autonomy supportive, regardless of your individual personality traits, you're more extroverted, you're more agreeable, you're more conscientious, you're more, this big 5, you're less neurotic, and you're more open to experience. And this is true across all the cultures that we've been able to study. So I'm going to just end on this last note about well-being. Different goals that we have in life satisfy needs differently. So some of us are pursuing goals for fame, for money, for achievement of different sorts, and some of us are achieving goals of trying to give to our communities, trying to have good relationships with others. And we argue that depending on what your life goals are, you will get different need satisfactions, and then you'll have different wellness as a result. This really comes out of the philosophy of Aristotle. We call it the eudaimonic philosophy. Aristotle argued that if you did the virtuous things in life, if you were good to other people, you would be happy. But if you strove directly for happiness, you probably would be less likely to end up happy. He thought it was a vulgar life goal. But we get different cultural messages. In our cultures, we're said, oh, get money, get fame. These are the things that will really make you happy. And unfortunately, a lot of our young people buy into it. The Pew surveys in the U.S. show that a lot of our young people have as their first or second most important goal making a lot of money. That's their life goal. So we decided to study these goals. We call them intrinsic versus extrinsic goals. People who tend to be caring about growth or relatedness or community or health, they tend to like all those values. But people who are into money are also into fame and into image, and those tend to hang together. So they form factors we call intrinsic and extrinsic goals. And this is just a sample of regular urban adults. We see that the more you're into intrinsic goals, the more likely you are to have fewer depressive symptoms, fewer headaches, fewer stomach aches, fewer symptoms of stress of all kinds, and to feel more self-actualized. And the opposite is true if you're into money, fame, and image. And this is true across the world, across different developmental groups. Even when you study business students, it's true within business students. It's true in educational students. It's true among lawyers. And I'm not going to go into all of this, but if you look at our culture and the way our culture's changed, to the extent that our culture is getting more symptomatic, it seems to be due to the shift in value systems. So Jeannie Twang, this is not a study from our group, she was from UCLA, she was doing a study of 70 years of reports from the MMPI on the mental health of American entering college students. And she finds that across that 70 years there's been more depressive symptoms and more antisocial attitudes in our students. And they tried every historical trend they could find to account for this trend. They looked at the changes in the economy, changes in religion, changes in family structure, and none of those things predicted this overall trend. What did predict it was they had value indices in there, and this is their interpretation. The pattern of change best fits a cultural model of change toward extrinsic rather than intrinsic goals that have negatively impacted youth. Over time, American culture has shifted toward an environment where more and more young people experience poor mental health and psychopathology, possibly due to an increased focus on money, on appearance, and status rather than on community and close relationships. That's why I moved to Australia, because it's not happening here. In general, our well-being is about our basic psychological needs. When we're getting them satisfied, in general, we have higher well-being. The basic psychological needs are the biggest predictor of our well-being. They're a bigger predictor than our income, than our relative income, than the wealth of our nation. This is not our study. This is a study by Ed Diener. It's the largest international study ever done on happiness. And you can see that actually when they got the results from the study, Diener wrote me a note immediately. He said, you're going to be really happy with the results because look at the effect sizes for basic psychological needs relative to other things. So, having that Mercedes does make you a little bit happy. But having intimacy, having close relationships with your children makes you a lot happier. And on a day-to-day basis, it's the things that, the need satisfactions that really drive happiness up and down away from our own averages. So this is just a quick graph of our students at the University of Rochester. Across the week, you'll see a ready pattern here that on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, they don't have a lot of happiness. Something happens on Friday afternoon. Happiness goes up a little bit and stays up until Sunday afternoon. And the opposite is true for negative affect. And we have no idea why this is. But really, it's about need satisfaction. On the weekend, they have a lot more autonomy. They're studying, but they're studying in the places and the ways and the schedules that they want to. And they're with the people that they care about and want to connect with. So we take this to American workers, and we find the same pattern in American workers. On days when you're feeling more autonomy and relatedness and competence, you're feeling more positive affect, less negative affect, more vitality, and for autonomy and relatedness, fewer physical symptoms. Now, there's a big work effect on this. One of the reasons that people have lower well-being on work days is because many other workplaces don't have a lot of relatedness and don't have a lot of support for autonomy. This is not a necessary condition in workplaces. People who have workplaces where they connect with their coworkers, where they feel autonomy over their job tasks, they have no big weekend effect. It's the people who really don't have that, who are alienated workers, who are waiting for the weekend. Probably most of you are waiting for this talk to be over. So I'm going to summarize with the following, which is, Self-determination theory argues that all of us were built to grow and to learn. But that growth and that learning and that integrity, that wellness, requires nutriments from our social environment that we have to provide. And when we provide those nutriments, good things happen for us. We're more intrinsically motivated. We're more likely to operate out of values and to internalize the social things that are around us. And in addition, to have stronger relationships. In general, when needs are satisfied, we have greater wellness. And so everywhere, self-determination theory tries to be critical about the environments, about our interventions, about our classrooms, about our workplaces, about our cultures, and says, what is it that's either working for or against need satisfaction? And that's the key to our research. And I thank you very much for your patience. I think I've worn out my time period here.
I've snuck in behind here.
So
I appreciate the spontaneous applause that you've given already for what's been obviously an extremely wide-ranging, thought-provoking, entertaining, engaging and stimulating lecture. We did indicate that there would be an opportunity for questions. We have one or two roving microphones, so if there are questions you'd like to take the opportunity to ask Richard, now is your opportunity.
And you should have complete autonomy to leave, by the way.
Yeah, thank you very much for a most enjoyable talk. So if somebody grows up without all those things, and they reach a point of, do they actually reach a point of no return when they all get screwed up, as an adult or whatever? Can we do anything about it?
So I hope everybody heard that question. If you really haven't gotten any of these nutriments in development, and you really then are in the desperate place that comes about when none of your needs are satisfied, can we, as a society or as clinicians or as friends, can we do anything about it? And of course, as a clinical psychologist, I have to answer, yes, we can. I believe that if we create the right kind of environment where we're responsive, we can rekindle this basic aspect of human nature. I couldn't be a therapist or a clinician without that basic faith that this is the case. I think it's much more difficult when you have someone who's faced severe deficits in need satisfaction throughout development. You're facing a much steeper climb, which requires even more patience, even stronger intervention, even more of an enriched environment. But I do believe that under those circumstances, we can optimize that person's wellness to the best degree possible. And of course, that's our goals as clinicians. It's a profound question, and I think I would have to answer yes to that.
Other questions? Don't be shy.
Janie Long from School of Public Health here. Thank you for the presentation. I'm really excited that it has so much application, so thanks for sharing. My question is just a quick one. What is your one-sentence advice on how to get a teenage boy to clean his room?
Well, that's a terrible question, by the way. And I want to say you've already heard that I can't answer anything in one sentence. I'd say a couple things about that. The first thing I would be doing as a parent is, a room is one's private space, and I'd be asking myself, why do I need that to happen? I'm not saying you shouldn't have that happen or not, but if there's a big conflict about something, I'd begin with the issue of, what's our need here? Is this an issue over which it's worth fighting the battle? And if it really is, if there was some reason why this is really, I think it's different if we were talking about leaving the mess in the kitchen or the living room in the public space of the house. But in the bedroom, I want to say that I would begin by wondering a bit, why are we in a battle over control for this space, which is typically a private space? Now that aside, let's say that we do decide that for whatever reason that's an important battle to fight, then I would want to give a good reason why it's an important battle to fight, and I should have one. If I have one, I say I can't come up with one, but if I could, I would want to give it. And I can come up with one for the public spaces in the house. I can easily come up with a rationale, and I would be able to convey why it's really important there, and why we have a value for that in our family to keep those public spaces neat and whatever else. So that first it would begin with the rationale. It would then begin, too, if I was really going to enforce this as a parent, because I'm not against enforcing limits as a parent. If I'm going to enforce their limit, it has to be done also with empathy, which is I would understand that you don't want to do this. And I have this good reason for doing it. And so here is the thing that's to be done. Trying to keep out of it as much of the control battle as possible. So I think those are really elements: empathy, good rationale, and the minimal amount of control necessary to get the behavior carried out. And under those circumstances, I think you have a higher likelihood of having a clean room. But I'm putting pretty low bets on it.
Now, I know we have another question at the back, two more at the front here then.
Thank you again for a wonderful talk. I'm just wondering, with regard to early childhood development, when children are at an age where they're having to learn so much so rapidly, how do you achieve that state where mastery is a more dominant experience?
Well, first you point out there's a premise to the question, which is a premise in our whole society, is why are we pushing so hard on our kids? Why do they need to learn so much so fast? I don't believe the evidence is there that we're really creating a better society by all that early developmental pressure. In fact, I'd look to some of the best achieving school systems in the world, like Finland, to say less pressure is probably better. The other thing is, when we look across kids are so different, and their developmental rates are so variable. And when we put pressure on kids towards specific outcomes, we're often inevitably going to be interfering with their autonomy, because they won't be able to feel that mastery. And for a lot of kids, if they can't feel mastery at an activity around which we've put a lot of importance, they have two choices. They can try really hard, but if they try really hard and they can't succeed, then they're really being reinforced in the attitude of they are stupid. So they have another alternative, and a lot of kids choose this route, which is, if I think I can't do it, I withdraw effort. I'd rather be called lazy than stupid. And we see a lot of withdrawal of effort, and this is that dip in 3rd and 4th grade really starts to take off, is because we see, as kids understand that there's an inverse relationship between ability and effort, they start to see that there's two ways they can have self-esteem. One is by succeeding at everything everybody's pressuring them to do, if they can. But if they can't, withdrawing effort seems like another way to salvage self-esteem. So I would say, though, I'm not a pessimist about a lot of rich learning going on in an environment. I think we can have a lot of rich learning if we, first of all, respect the individual. We scaffold all learning so that every kid can feel increasing success at the activity at whatever part of the developmental line they are on. And this means that it's not going to be uniform across every kid. It's not going to be that every 8-year-old knows X. This is a problem with high-stakes testing. High-stakes testing is one of the most damaging things we have done to our schools. It's destroying classroom teaching practices. It's destroying the self-esteem of so many kids, and it's killing their learning and motivation. I'm totally against high-stakes testing as a way of I'm not against testing. I'm a psychologist after all. But I'm against high-stakes testing, putting strong pressure behind specific outcomes instead of understanding what this child needs to make the next step at every. And so the supporting relatedness, supporting competence scaffolding, and supporting autonomy at every step will create the most learning that you can get out of anybody. And that's what we should be aspiring to in our schools.
So we've got two more down the front here, Emma. Yep, one here and one here.
You were mentioning before, in terms of the dental assistant, using a positive image for the flossing,
Yes.
It's better. So what do you say about the campaign to put those very horrendous pictures on the cigarettes packaging? And do you think it has any effect on the smoker? Thank you.
Well, first we have to say that there's been a lot of successful public health campaigns that have convinced people to stop smoking. And most of that has been the informational side of public health campaigns. It's mostly, as we've known more and more about the diseases and problems that come with smoking, people have been willing to give up smoking. And I'm somebody who works in the smoking cessation area. We've done a number of randomized controlled trials. I think when I run into a smoker who's really a die-hard smoker and I find out why they're continuing to smoke, I know that that package is having no impact on that person. What's having an impact on that person is the stresses in their lives they don't know how to cope with, and they're using cigarettes as a way of emotionally coping at that time. They're in an alienated job where they feel a lot of anger and they need to go outside and have a smoke every once in a while, and they're wondering why are we trying to take that away? Or they don't see the skills or the competencies, or they haven't been introduced to the medications, particularly, that can be really, really helpful to that. So I much think that when we're dealing with die-hard smokers, that's a really bad phrase, isn't it? When we're dealing with people who are really ingrained smokers, that it's not going to be fear that's going to drive them away from these things. It's going to be information, and it's going to be help. Pharmacological help, informational help, and clinical help in the cases where that's necessary. There is some evidence that the burnt lungs and all those other things has some effect on smoking rates. I think that's probably reliable information, but I would say that there's a much bigger effect size for the information campaign that's gone on over years.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. What you were just saying about the grade 3s, I have an 8-year-old daughter who struggles with maths, and this year was the first year she got a maths test, folded it up and put it on the floor and refused to do it. So that absolutely rings home. But as a parent, how can we best influence schools to implement intrinsic motivation when teachers are pressured to teach to the test? Mm-hmm. How do we do that?
Well, so how can parents influence the government? Sorry. No, well, you know, I can't speak as much here in Australia because I'm just learning the political system here. But I can tell you what's going on in my state of New York right now. So there's been a conglomerate of test makers, Pearson in particular, and big money people like the Gates Foundation and a number of other people who